morning, everyone, and welcome to our series Fintech Fridays, brought to you by Video Australia. In our webinar today, we'll be talking about ESG in Fintech. My name is Tim Aman. I'm Video's Global Fintech Leader, as well as our National Financial Services Leader. I'd firstly like to begin our session today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and today a special mention to the first inventors, innovators, and traditional custodians of the land. From ancient superhighways for trade, long-distance communication systems, and unique social systems, sustainable agricultural practices, and bush medicine. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples and communities listening today. Before we kick things off, I'd like to quickly draw your attention to the housekeeping slide that is currently showing on your screen. Today, to start, you're all automatically muted, but we'll be accepting questions throughout the session, and you can submit these using the question tab. I know a few people have actually already submitted a few, so we'll try to weave that into the conversation today. If we don't get to all the questions, we'll follow up with you after the session is completed. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please click the support button, which is one of the bottom tabs on your screen. And finally, this session is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email containing the slides, a link to the recording, access to future sessions, and the speaker contact details for all of us. As environmental, social, and governance criteria continue to gain prominence, it's vital that fintech companies understand their significance. ESG principles can align businesses with global sustainability goals, enhance their reputation, mitigate risk, and foster long-term value creation. Throughout this session, we'll delve into key aspects of ESG and explore how fintechs can effectively integrate them into their operations for sustainable growth and positive impact. With me today is Dr. Lili Sussman, Female Fintech Leader of the Year in 2023. Lili has a wealth of experience in fintech and social ventures. She was previously the Chief Strategy Officer at both Social Ventures Australia and Wiser. She's currently the Chair of the Board of Advisors for Financing and has just launched a coaching company to help companies scale up. Lili works with the CEO and executive team to implement a comprehensive system to master people, strategy, execution, and cash to unlock high growth. I'm also joined by Viisti Dickens, ESG and Strategy and Transformation Director at BDO. Viisti has extensive experience in shaping and executing programs, ESG and enterprise culture change across financial services, TMT, government, and the education sector. She has also served on the global board of the Change Management Institute, amongst many other committees and foundations. Welcome both, and thank you to attending the FinTech Friday session.
Thanks, Tim. Happy to be here.
So we'll go into a little bit of an overview of ESG in the fintech sector. ESG considerations have traditionally taken a backseat in the fintech sector, where innovation and disruption have been the initial primary focus. However, there's significant opportunity for fintechs to lead the way in integrating ESG principles, positioning themselves as pioneers in sustainability and social responsibility while driving positive change in the industry. You can see on the slide here, recent years, fintech ESG space has been developing rapidly and outpacing the fintech sector overall in terms of VC funding. Overall, there's been a significant portion of ESG fintech activity focused on carbon emission solutions following the global net zero commitments. And for those online that were able to attend the session we had on fintech net zero, Viisti was leading a panelist discussion on that, and it was a great session with Fintech Australia and Australia. Domestically, demand for the fintech ESG solutions has largely been driven by the banking and asset management sectors, primarily as incumbent financial services providers who have to meet regulatory and their own ESG obligations. You can also start to see on the right-hand side of the screen, we're starting to see fintech sort of either pivot on their traditional strategy, or we're seeing an emergence of pure play sort of ESG fintechs. So those are some of the topics that we will be talking about. So maybe, Lili, I'll start with you. Can you just talk everyone through the fundamental pillars of ESG and how they apply to fintech companies?
Yeah, so I think, fintech companies were often building the system, the kind of global financial system, and it's very essential services that we're providing. And ESG affects everyone, every type of company, and it certainly affects fintech. I mean, we all know ESG, environmental social governance. I think it actually means different things to people. There's a lot of, I think, measurement and robustness going on in the E in environment. And we all know the importance of a transition to a green economy and the roles that every sector has to play in that. So I think there's a lot going on there, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But I think S and G, they're also very important. They're just less talked about. S, traditionally, social has been affiliated with things like modern slavery, making sure that, you're not doing societal harm. But I think there's also a lot more focus more recently on social impact more generally and equity in particular. So, there's all of the gender pay gap reporting news that came out a couple of weeks. I mean, it's so important to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So we'll talk more about that as well, but that's a big part of S. And I really just generally think, we're all humans building companies for humans. And so the S is actually a really great thing to think about and very important to how we do business and what business we're in. And G is governance, which is just about making good decisions, right? That's how I think about governance. There's a lot of, law around it, and shareholder capitalism is set up in a certain way where we have formal governance, but it is about making good decisions, right? And so that is very much about rules and how we set things up, but even more about culture, which is how we make good decisions. So I think E, S, and G, it's not like a sideline thing. In my mind, it's very central because it's about what kind of company you're building. How do you go about building your company? How do you make sure you're building your company in the right way that will make good decisions, have positive social impact, be a net gain to society and nature? These are kind of fundamental things we think about as humans anyways. So ESG, in my mind, isn't sort of a regulatory side bucket, just something we have to think about, but actually just, hey, how am I building my company?
Yeah, it's quite a couple quick things. It's for people that are watching us, we are all in the same room. So we're doing our best to look forward, but you might see us sort of like looking at each other. So and it's kind of interesting, Viisti, I think maybe I'll get your perspective on ESG. I sometimes try to impress my 17-year-old daughter, and I mentioned we're having an ESG net zero and we're having an ESG in the fintech sector. And she looked at me and she said, what exactly is ESG? And so I think when we look at that every day, and we know it's very, very topical, but I think there's still that element of how do we educate more people about that? But Viisti, maybe add your lens to what does ESG mean to you?
Yeah, thank you. And I think, look, that's been a great conversation so far in terms of covering what are some of the key considerations, environment, climate, carbon change, energy, biodiversity, social, it's those diversity, inclusion, but also your customers, to your point about your daughter, how are consumer spending habits changing, the way that, funding is changing as well around that. And I think an example I saw from the US is called Accountable, where it actually helps consumers shop and spend with brands aligned to their social or environmental kind of goals. So it's interesting the way that it's sort of connecting back through to customers, as well as being a value proposition for employees that want to be working, for companies that have a purpose or values that are aligned to their own. And I think on the governance piece, it's things like, guest decision making and how that plays into risk frameworks as well, because ESG often sits across different sort of risk classes. So I was talking to a chief risk officer of a company a couple of weeks ago who was using this idea of transversal. So ESG sort of sits across many different parts of the business, which I think is really interesting because from a impact perspective in terms of your own impact as a fintech, it's looking at your financial impact as well as the environmental and social. So there's this idea of double materiality at play there as well. And also thinking about, your value chain and how you fit into the value chain of others, be it your investors or, your customers, suppliers, etc. So there's this kind of continuum across that I think is sort of bringing a broader stakeholder perspective to considering ESG for the business. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, so maybe I guess, Lili, how can fintech sort of navigate the complexity of ESG metrics and reporting standards? I guess that's people are starting to think through ESG measurement we're starting to see is quite difficult, sort of out of Europe, for example. I think in the fintech space, we have a great opportunity if someone can get on the front foot and look at the metrics and the reporting standards. But maybe if you can give a bit of advice in terms of how they can sort of navigate to get started on the ESG journey.
Yeah, I would say don't let perfection get in the way. You know, it's really complex. Once you start Googling how to measure even basic things like what's my carbon footprint, you know, there's fantastic tools out there, but there's a lot of different frameworks, lots and lots of different frameworks. It can get very onerous, very complex, and we are all-time poor, right? We're trying to scale our businesses, and I think you just got to do something, right? So when I started looking at it at Wiser, we were a purpose-led company. We very much wanted to think about it, and yet it was like, okay, there's this thing on the side that we need to all learn more about, and what is it? And I looked at different frameworks. It's, you know, the United Nations got different frameworks, Morgan Stanley Capital International, you know, ISB. There's just so many different kind of standards you can look at when you start measuring and trying to even define what are the buckets in E, F, and G. So it was a big rabbit hole for me, which can take up time, and we don't have time. So it was very practically just like pick a framework that most suits your business, right? There's not one right one or wrong one, and you know, Viisti, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but we were just wanting to start with something like, let's actually just pin down what we think E is, what S is, you know, what G is, and we started with scope 1 and 2 emissions in E, for example, but we didn't do scope 3, which is coming and it's important. But it was just, we started with, hey, what does our company, you know, leave in terms of our carbon footprint? How can we work on that? And we partnered with another great startup, Trace, which works with small businesses, small medium businesses to measure, make it easy to measure the carbon footprint and offset it through really high quality projects, and also work with us to actually embed actually try and educate all of us so that we can engage with these topics in a deep way rather than it being some kind of risk regulatory reporting exercise, which is on the side. So Trace came into our organization, presented to us, you know, we all kind of did our individual challenges, like people who wanted to might have said, okay, I'm going to eat 2 vegetarian meals a week as my pledge, right, to do better. So it's all these tiny little kind of behavioral things that we actually engaged our people on that make the difference. It isn't just a reporting thing. So the reporting is important, but I would say don't let the standards freak you out. Just go and define something like, what do you think is good decision making? What do you think matters in terms of how you treat your people and, you know, what matters in social impact, not only the impact you have on your employees, but your stakeholders, your suppliers, your customers, you know, everybody that you're actually, whose lives you're touching, right? What do you think good looks like? And then environment, that one's easy, right? You can measure your footprint and reduce it and offset it and work with and educate team members. And by the way, lots of team members loved it and wanted to do it. It wasn't like they have to. You know, there's going to be people in your office who are very passionate about one or the other of these subjects. So just engage them. It's actually a fabulous way of building the culture because these are just issues that everybody cares about. We want to be building a better world. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, you touched on some good points in terms of the culture piece, and maybe this day, I think, you know, maybe if you can, yeah, we've got fintechs out there that maybe haven't started the journey. You know, if you're trying to decide, you know, do you focus on environmental, social, governance, or do you try to tackle all 3? What sort of advice would you give to the fintechs out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think they're all very much interrelated. So even if you start at sort of the governance part, well, you're going to be reporting on your emissions and carbon, and you're going to be reporting on your diversity inclusion metrics and your probably employee engagement scores, things like that. So they all form part of a picture that is used for investors. And I was at an industry event last week where a CEO of a logistics company, so different sector, but was talking about how she turned the business around in some of those metrics, just by focusing on that sort of the governance, but the interrelationship between the environment and the social. And it turned the culture around. So to your point, the NPS score went from a negative right up to a positive. Lili, so you're talking about the kind of the culture piece, but also it meant that it was much more attractive for investors and the way that they sort of structured their business. So I think for fintechs, it's starting with, you know, the non-negotiables. We've seen a lot of voluntary reporting over the last few years. And, you know, as Lili said, there's been different frameworks in play. There's been GRI, you know, the Global Reporting Index. There's been the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, there's many different global frameworks that have been used in different ways. And we're starting to see more of a move to global harmonization about some of the reporting aspects, which, you know, things like principles of responsible investment, but some of the sort of ISSB standards that are being adopted. So there's a linkage now between the financial reporting and the sustainability reporting in these different areas as well. So I think the advice for fintechs, to answer Tim's question, is really just, you know, an awareness of this changing environment in terms of the must-dos from a regulatory perspective, but B, the way that you can kind of embed and operationalize that in your business, as Lili was saying, and use that to your advantage in terms of being able to, you know, drive better performance, because actually some of the behaviours of your customers and employees will also impact your overall footprint. Did you want to come and sit next to me, actually? We've just had a little bit of tech things. I'm going to be joined here. Lisa's going to come and we'll have more of a fireside chat with you now.
This will be good.
Yeah.
Now I can look straight ahead. So we've got this in
Yeah.
and Lili right in front of me. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
There we go.
So, okay. So we'll continue on. The so I think we'll talk a little bit more about culture as well, because I think that's gonna, again, in the fintech space, it's a great opportunity because a lot of the fintechs are purpose-led companies, and ESG naturally fits into the wheelhouse of why a lot of fintechs were started in the first place. And maybe Lili, just coming back to you and some of your experience as the strategy officer, probably what was the biggest and surprising challenge when you're first setting up sort of ESG initiatives and planning how that was going to be embedded in sort of in the future growth plans? You touched a little bit about why or what you were thinking about, but maybe just add a little bit about that sort of journey.
Yeah, I think there is a kind of two levels of challenge. One level is if you're not used to, if you're starting your ESG journey like we were, like most fintechs are, it's not part of BAU. So it can feel like it's just a side initiative. Can somebody just do it and get it out of the way, right? It feels like a have to and something on top of the to-do list that's already long. And that makes it hard because it's not a want to, it's a have to, right? So one level is just, what's the narrative about this, you know, inside your actual strategy? Like, what's the relationship between ESG? Is it a regulatory, you know, risk management thing that's on the side, or is this actually central to what we're trying to do here? So that's important to actually have that conversation about that, and you've got to have that conversation at the leadership team table, first and foremost. So I think that's the first level challenge, which is, does this even matter to us? You know, why does this matter to us? To us as people, to us as a team, you know, to our organization. And then secondly is just being practical, which is kind of what I said. Don't get overwhelmed by, you know, how much you could do or have to do. Don't be, you know, you get overwhelmed by the idea of starting to measure scope 3 emissions, for example, right? Not just what me and my team and, you know, our office and our commutes and all that, but also our suppliers, which is scope 2, but then scope 3 is like, well, the impact of all of our activities on the world. That could be really hard to measure, right? Just don't let that hard, you know, difficulty stop you from starting, right? Take some steps and then just evolve it from there, right? I think the trick is to move it from the, oh my God, I have to write an annual report and I've got to put these measures down and the board's going to look at it. And it's more of a sort of like tick the box have to, just moving it from there into the, this is actually fun. You know, we love to be a great company. We actually just love to be great humans and to be a great company. And this is a fun conversation about how we can do better. And that's very energizing and engaging for the whole team. You know, so I think flipping the lens from a constraint, have to, standard, you know, into a want to, this is such a chance for us to really enjoy our work, you know, and to do something that's meaningful to us.
Yeah.
And make that part of how we do business. I think that conversation is probably the biggest one and the biggest challenge that you have to face head on first before you get into the technicalities of, you know, how we actually work on ESG. Because how you work on ESG, like it will come out because what's low-hanging fruit, what are you guys passionate about doing, you know, just get on that wagon, but get on it by having that conversation first with everyone, which is like, how can we make this fun? What does this mean to us? You know, what do we care about? And each person will have their own views, and that's all good.
Yeah, and building on that, I think that's kind of how we approach a sort of materiality assessment, where we look at the kind of key internal and external stakeholders, and we have a process where we go through and identify what the priorities are in terms of those material impacts. Yeah, and then how do we focus effort on those? And I've seen that sort of play out in a number of ways. One is, you know, you have positive screening by investors that are looking for some of those impacts, you know, and there's an alignment there. So you're more likely to get funding. That's the first part. And that will impact, you know, valuations potentially as well. And then secondly, it might be, oh, there's some great customer research you can do, you know, demographic, maybe it's a Gen Z. They're actually interested more in sort of green loans or a sort of more of a green related product. Notwithstanding, you know, not greenwashing, but it's legitimately a sort of more of a sustainable investment product, which we saw with one, you know, fintech that we're talking to. And so they've had a really huge growth actually by virtue of focusing in on a particular customer group that is really passionate about a certain type of product. And the other one is, you know, we had at our fintech panel, those that are really focused in their core purpose on actual sustainable products. You know, there's this Good for B that has business loans for sustainable brands, Cleaner, which is measuring carbon, and Slip, which is actually moving away from paper and chemical-based receipts towards digital. So they're like three great examples of companies that have really integrated, you know, the principles into sort of their core business value proposition. So I think it's looking at, you know, what's your value proposition and where can you integrate some of these ESG principles to help really drive that value. So it's about sort of value creation more than just the, you know, mitigating risk and the value erosion that might come from not getting it right with respect to your stakeholders or, you know, climate risk or social and other kinds of considerations.
And I think that's where the fintech ecosystem has a great advantage. So if you look at other companies that are trying to implement and adopt ESG, legacy companies, mature practices, probably some issues from a regulatory perspective, hard to change the needle. And the ability for fintechs to be agile, and it links back to, again, how fintechs were started in the first place. You know, they're purpose-led, great cultures, typically very agile. So that's why I think there's a great opportunity for fintechs to be able to figure out what they want to be able to stand for. And it links in a little bit with what you talked about in terms of that culture piece, you know, and it's also the time piece because, you know, fintechs are, you know, they need to be profitable, make some money, and you know, the trick is how you can implement what you're doing in ESG that's going to prove to be successful in the long term. And so maybe just switching, and Viisti talked about a few of those, but I'll go back to Lili, like some practical examples of where you've seen sort of products that link in nicely with what fintechs are doing, just to give some people some additional color on that.
Yeah, so, you know, I think the audience will have good answers to this. You know, and Viisti has just mentioned, I know Good for B, for example, fund is business lending for sustainable businesses, right? And the idea is sustainable businesses are better for because, you know, of their behavioral profile. And I think there's a lot of ways, I mean, obviously Australia is actually an economy where think 30% of households now are powered by solar. You know, it's not a small number, and we're still behind the curve. So there's a lot of financing and financial products that are going to support consumers and businesses going green. Lots and lots of them, right? And obviously the fintech sector is there to support with payments, with lending, with all kinds of products and services. So there's lots of product opportunities, right? But I would say for every fintech, whether or not you have a product that is, you know, obviously an ESG product, you gain a lot by starting your ESG journey and embedding it just as part of the conversation of what you guys are here to do. Because whatever it is, you have to be a good citizen, right? It's part of our social license to operate, especially if you're going to be a disruptor, and especially if you're going to be a challenger to existing, existing players who maybe don't have as much of a great reputation, and that's part of why you're skimming off their customers, right? So I definitely think that being the right kind of company and building leadership teams that are really engaged with what's the kind of company we want to build, and having those robust conversations, that actually builds a level of strategic alignment, that builds a level of conversation about multiple stakeholders that you need to have. And it also builds a culture where leaders are role models for the rest of your organization. And we mostly have young workforces, you know, in fintech. They really care about ESG, right? And so it's a way of engaging our people authentically by caring ourselves and learning about it ourselves. And I think it doesn't matter where you are on the journey. If you're where zero, I've never thought about ESG, you know, or I'm super passionate, my business is all about, you know, something within the ESG bucket. Either way, there's more to learn. And as I said, it's fun, right? Because it's fun to think about how we can make the world a better place. Yeah. So I would just say it's for everyone.
Yeah, and just a couple of points of clarification. Lily said we're behind. I mean, she's not Australian, so she's an American. But I think in terms of there, you know, so I think, like, again, the good part, and maybe this is more of a comment, like, we do have people listening in globally. Are you starting to see good examples of, you know, global fintech companies that are really focused on ESG, and if they are coming into Australia?
Yeah, great question. I think it's a really evolving landscape, and I love the first slide that you shared, which showed us, you know, graphically that movement of both the capital, but also the types of focus areas for ESG fintech. So I think that was a really clear message to say it's a growth story, and that it's evolving in terms of the opportunities to tackle different issues, be it more on the energy focus, you know, climate focus, diversity, etc. One example I came across from the US is Raise Green, which is a crowdsourced local impact investing fund focused on climate sort of activities. And I thought that's really interesting because there's this bringing together of the idea of impact investing, but your ability to kind of participate from a more of a community platform, crowdsourcing. And, you know, if you don't have a lot of funds, you can still, you know, have a growth story in terms of your investment in a way that's meaningful to you individually, which kind of ties into the theme that Lily was articulating around, you know, this idea of purpose, culture, employee engagement, and actually thinking about the fact that your employees are potentially your customers too. You know, that's been a big bank mindset for a long time, and I think it's interesting to think about how that relates also for fintechs, because people are starting to shop and spend aligned to their, you know, values. There's this idea of financial inclusion, and, you know, how do you cater for diverse customers? And then also thinking about some of the sort of climatic impacts in different regions, which might be affecting as well from a sort of a risk profile. So that tends that there's a bit of a geopolitical kind of climate risk overlay around different types of trends there as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity globally. I think more on the sort of ESG framework side, Australia is really, you know, following the Europe and US, Canada had regulations passed last week. So, you know, ours are in draft format in that sense in terms of what we need to start saying from a reporting perspective. But from a opportunity and a product perspective, I think, it's an evolving landscape. There's an example in Singapore, which is Climate X, is more focused on carbon marketplace. So, there's a range of different ways of constructing a value proposition that brings together data, tech, an aspect of a financial system, to Lili's earlier point, and then also the ability to have an impact in some really meaningful way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I think globally you're starting to see, I think for a long time everyone was thinking this is EU, a European problem. Countries will catch up, certain countries will sign, different things in terms of the protocols about net zero. So, but all of a sudden you're starting to see countries start to leapfrog each other. So one week could be in Singapore, then you hear something coming out of India, then the US is waking up, and so you're starting to see a bit of momentum because I think people are starting to realize that from a country perspective, you got to get on board to what you both are saying. And then secondly, it's going to be an opportunity for companies to be based in a particular country. So I think it's going to be a way to attract countries to be based in country if it's the right ESG type environment. I think maybe, Lili, is there a global fintech that you're seeing that you say that they're a great example, and maybe more on the social and governance piece? You touched on social and governance is sometimes a little bit forgotten because environmental sort of jumps out as an obvious one. But is there someone you're seeing or watching globally that you feel is adopting the ESG quite well?
Oh, that's a good question. Viisti, you might be, probably a better place to answer from fintech. I've been researching lately a lot, working in the S space because I am chair of the board of advisors at Viisti. So Viisti, for anybody that doesn't know, was a sort of leader in the Australian market for using data to measure the gender equity gap. What is the size of the gender equity gap? What's it about? What are all the actual data behind it? What are the different components? So it's been publishing a quarterly report called the Women's Index on that for about 7 years now. And that has really changed the conversation we've had around the issue. Like, is it an issue? How big of an issue is it? What can we do about it? And I think putting that robust measurement around that. So more recently, Viisti started building diversity and equity inclusion tech. And so now we've got a platform that instead of an HR manager trying to measure gender pay gap and all these other things and not really knowing what to measure and trying to do it on an Excel spreadsheet, there's a robust platform there which says, hey, upload your data, you get asked the questions, and you will actually get, a dashboard and in kind of benchmarking, right? You can see like what you're actually doing well and not, and what good looks like. And that hasn't existed before, but we've been looking at other markets, and some of these companies are cropping up in the US. There are companies like D&I, Diversio. So there's kind of tech platforms, I wouldn't call it fintech, right? SaaS businesses, but there are tech platforms that are coming up to try and address S in a more robust way, and there's obviously a lot of reg tech out there. And I think making good decisions is actually part of how, like the G, I haven't seen too many kind of software solutions that are trying to tackle that, right? But I certainly see a lot of, this is more in the sort of leadership consulting space, which is how do you know when you've got the right leadership that's making good decisions, right? Like whether that's doing board reviews or, all kinds of things are out there. As a coach, I work with CEOs and leadership teams. And it becomes very clear as you go through structured processes of aligning and developing strategy and execution planning together, whether or not the team is cohesive and is not just cohesive, but also able to mine effectively for conflict. So are you getting high quality of decisions because you've got psychological safety and the habits of challenging each other, but in a constructive way? So all those things are more behavioral traits that you can improve governance. I haven't seen too many tech solutions or companies that are, trying to build really big scalable solutions to that, because they are about changing human behavior. So I think there's a way to change human behavior. Some of it could be digital, but I haven't seen too much, but I definitely see stuff cropping up in the S sector. And obviously E is huge, right? Everybody knows E is huge. So there are, you know, in tech broadly, whether it's fintech or other spaces, there's lots and lots of people trying to build things that are, you know, really in the eye of the storm when it comes to ESG. But I also think every company is now paying attention to ESG. It obviously has to. On the S, there's all these regulatory forces, right? Like the psychosocial safety hazards, the sexual harassment, all of that's new. That's new regulation that's come out in the last year. So, you know, and of course, WGEA gender gap reporting, right? So every company is like scrambling and thinking, oh my God, you know, we need to measure this. We need to get on top. We need to know what we're doing. Our boards are actually definitely going to be asking us, you know, and also we care, right? We'd like to make this better. And it's just piecing together what's our part in it. Like our company, we've got our products and services, but how can we do ESG better? And I guarantee you, you can, right? In a series of small steps, you can, whatever that may be. So just do some things better than nothing. Everything's a bonus, I think.
Yeah, and I think two things from that are sort of the idea of transparency and accountability. And I think that's sort of core to, it's on the reporting side, but also from an investment attraction side, right? Because when you're scaling, you might get to the point that you'll have different, you know, indexes looking at some of these metrics as their decision criteria. And I know even we have a woman on our team from Norway that's telling us about, you know, Norwegian banks now are looking at the gender equity in leadership teams, and they won't engage professional services firms or from a procurement perspective unless, you know, they have certain gender equity metrics met, which is quite interesting. So I think there's different ways of kind of playing that into a kind of procurement and business decision making.
Yeah, I just saw something on how the Treasury, the Australian Treasury, you know, the Australian government's also doing that. So they're changing their procurement standards. So that's going to have a wave of impact across lots and lots of service provision organizations that provide services into the government. So I think, yeah, I feel like used to be quite peripheral, you know, and it was like, well, unless I, you know, really feel like modern slavery is an issue in my employee supplier chain, which for many fintechs, it's sort of like, no, you know, I don't think it's an issue. Like people didn't know how to think about S or what to do. All of a sudden, the bar is way higher, right? The bar is way, way higher now. It's like, well, how are you treating your employees? You know, are you making serious attempts at measuring and improving equity? And that's what, you know, Impact or Finance's platform exists to solve. But I think we're going to see more and more companies using it, no doubt, and they're going to have to. And I think people are going to get more sophisticated around it. I don't think anyone here, you know, leading a business is not thinking about equity issues at all, right? Of course, you're looking at your gender pay gap, and of course, you're looking at the balance. But it's more complicated than that. It's just not just one or two measures, right? It's actually quite a complex thing to create a genuinely inclusive environment. So, you know, we've all been raised in a patriarchal environment, and we all have it inside us. And it's just, you know, it's like the discovery and peeling back layers and layers of unconscious bias. It applies to us all, you know, women too. And so I think it's sort of a journey that every leader is on in just investigating it. You know, I don't think anybody is in a position where, okay, I know exactly what S is, or, you know, I know exactly how to be, you know, I'm a perfectly inclusive leader, right? I mean, like, I think it's a bit of a journey. So I think it can be quite fun. It's like, that's why I always like to put ESG in the fun bucket. It's personal development, right? Yeah. How can I be a better human? How can I be a better leader? By the way, how can I run a better business? One that attracts more funding, one that takes advantage of the trends that we see, like the entire world is turning toward ESG. So there's definitely business opportunities there. As you said, value creation, right? All of these things kind of come together and it's a win-win, but I have to understand this is central to, you know, how I'm building my business. I'm going to go find that win-win. I'm going to use it to build a great culture. I'm going to use it to deepen my own leadership and make myself a better leader. And I'm going to use it as a way of driving important strategic conversations we need to be having at the leadership team level.
Yeah, I really like that frame of the tone from the top and sort of this idea of your leadership shadow, the shadow you cast and the extent to which that sort of embodies different aspects of the E and the S and the G. I'm also interested, if I may, ask the audience to, because we're talking about different global examples and we're not across everything as much as we try to be reading in the sector every day. I saw today on my way into work, there was a piece around AI, greenwashing, and how that's like an area of focus now. But interested if other people have got examples they wanted to put in the chat. I can ask that question just so we get some inputs as well from the audience. But yeah, Tim.
So this is one of the reasons I didn't want the two of them to sit next to each other. So I'm the third person in the room. But yeah, so it's great. So it's great to watch the two of you play off on each other. So it's obviously very topical. Finance, great company. I've had the CEO on before, and so I think we're starting to see S really sort of gain prominence, a lot more quickly, sort of here in Australia. One thing I was gonna just sort of, ask is, yes, it's fun, it's on the agenda, but what are some of the governance frameworks that people have to put within the company? Because it's great to talk about how we're going to look to close diversity issues or pay gap issues or have two tofu sandwiches, but what's the best way for companies to come up with a governance structure that they can kind of measure as they're going on that particular journey?
I think, we go back to the sort of voluntary versus mandatory lens to things. And, we're moving towards more oversight driven by these harmonization globally around key things like strategy, risk, and then some of the metrics pieces and the governance. So how do you demonstrate that in a meaningful way so that you can be assessed on it externally to make sure that you're kind of up to scratch? And part of it is around looking at, how that accountability sits across different functions, some of the board structures. We talked a bit about decision making, but also just some of that tone from the top, how that might manifest in certain policies, frameworks, documents, stakeholder feedback, so we see that from that sort of materiality consideration. And, gap assessments around what's working well, where there's room for improvement in certain areas operationally or otherwise. So there's a number of ways we can kind of look at it from a, how are you set up for success in these different areas as a business in the first instance, and then, how is that perceived sort of in the marketplace and by your stakeholders, and actually do you meet those, minimum standards in terms of compliance and regulatory environment. And those are things, APRA, ASIC, the ACCC, in an Australian context, are all very focused on. But if you are doing business, globally, then obviously you're beholden to a whole bunch of other considerations by virtue of other jurisdictions in which you're sort of operating that you have to kind of take into account as well. Yeah.
And maybe, Lily, maybe just coming back to some of your other experience, I guess, they're trying to embed ESG into the main, the everyday working life at a place like a Wiser, for example. And how did you make ESG, the goals of ESG align with the wider business goals? Now, you might say you were purpose-led, but in terms of, but I guess in terms of advice, because if we're looking at a brand new fintech out there, or someone who's looking to pivot, what kind of advice would you give that particular company?
That's a good question. If you're in the stage of you haven't found a unique and valuable market position yet, which is a lot of both startups and scale-ups, then you have to do more work on strategy, right? And I think, when you're doing work on strategy, you need to understand what the market map looks like and what the trends look like. And so if there's white space because there are tailwinds based on regulatory things that are happening that are driving the ESG agenda, those might be creating white space that wasn't there a year or two ago. So that might very well impact what strategy you go after, like what new products and services, or how you're going to pivot your current products and services. Where else are you going to go to? What are the differentiators you're really building, behind what looks like a product and service that many people offer, but what are you really building that is kind of, building into a white space where you're competing on a unique dimension. So that could be, which is just, hey, try and understand how consumers are changing, which they are on D and S, right? But if you already have your product and services and you're just thinking, okay, but how can I be more, understand the regulation, understand the kind of what standards are moving, right, on E and S and G. How do I know what good looks like and stay on top of that? And how do I make sure my organization's actually keeping up? That one is less of a overall strategy question, and I think, going back to my earlier point, more of a culture question. How are you going to learn about this, right? How are you going to stay ahead of the curve if you're not having the conversation, right? And if you're not having the conversation, is that because there's fear there that we don't know what we're doing, this can make us look bad if we start talking about it, we realize we don't know what we're doing? Like, what's the fear? What's holding back? Why not have that conversation and have that conversation at the leadership team table? I mean, I genuinely think, especially when it comes to all of this, all decisions inside your business, but especially, say, governance, which is about good decision making. I mean, the executive team, like people on the ground, know a lot more than the board, right? The board's job is to try and, suss it out and try and figure out what's going on. But the executive team are on the ground and know what's happening, right? So whether or not the team is making good decisions, it's really up to people, right? It's like you can't just rely on the board for good governance, right? And it isn't just are we having the right risk meetings and going through the risk register in a robust way, and are we doing the measurement? Like, yeah, that's all important, but it's actually, are we talking enough about our impact and about looking at how we're serving all our multiple stakeholders, right? And are we creating an environment where bad decision making is going to be, it's safe enough to talk about? That's really the critical thing, right? The critical thing in my mind about good governance or not is, are you making good decisions? You're not going to know that if you don't have a psychologically safe environment where people can say, something's wrong here, or my gut is disagreeing. Like, if anyone around the table is not comfortable with saying my gut disagrees, then you have not built enough psychological safety. You're probably not going to get the best quality of decisions, And I ask every CEO, every founder, how good are you at mining for conflict? What's your personal relationship with conflict? And if it's like I said, okay, if there's a scale of 1 to 10 of what your personal relationship with conflict is, and 10 is like 10 out of 10, extremely comfortable. At what point do you peel off as we count up to 10, And like how much real constructive conflict is there happening in the organization? Because if there's not that much, then you're probably not going to have great governance, Yeah. So this is very much a cultural and behavioral thing. Yeah, so it's like there's this usual stuff, right? There's like the strategy, there's the risk management, there's the reporting, but then there's the heart of it, which is how are you running your company?
And maybe just I'll ask a follow on, you can answer that. But I think when you're going to talk to companies, what are you seeing people miss when they're starting down this journey? Because it might link a little bit with what Lily's talking about the culture. But for this to work, how do the company set themselves up for success? And if they can't ask the tough questions, or that people don't feel safe to answer in a particular way, that's probably, they're going to struggle to get out of the box. But maybe you can give some examples of what you've been seeing when you go talk to companies about as they're embarking on this ESG journey.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation. I could talk also for hours around sort of that culture and behaviour. People, have earlier in career worked more on the post-royal commission sort of aspects of that in larger kind of entities. So I think it's still topical for any organisation. Are you asking the right questions? That's the first part. So you look at the types of questions that are being asked and the way in which, to Lily's point, there is an ability to sit with different perspectives around things, be able to bring a kind of a risk lens or a strategy growth lens or a stakeholder lens or a reputation brand lens. And so I think sometimes in this process, you're actually surfacing these different perspectives around a particular kind of an issue. You know, the piece you mentioned earlier around social license versus sort of the customer and addressable market piece versus, you know, sort of consumer behaviour and noting that there's a social change happening as well. So all of these things sort of into play. So I think it's looking at are people willing to challenge the value proposition and think about how they can integrate ESG differently to either have an impact on their own footprint in terms of the environmental, social, and or to kind of almost disrupt the value chain within which they sit. So that's kind of the key call out. Or are you looking to just recut existing activities and communicate them in a different way? Because that's the easier way to go is, you know, and that's where you start to get into a bit of greenwashing risk territory, because you might be overstating certain credentials and or, you know, disclosing in a particular way that sort of positions you advantageously, but you're maybe not actually dealing with some of the operational or other aspects of, you know, actually having a really positive impact. So I think it's being able to kind of jump between those different lenses and perspectives as you're having those discussions, and certainly, you know, one, committing to making it part of your impact, two, you know, noting that double materiality, the financial, environmental, you know, three, just having a rethink about your value chain and your value proposition, you know, and how you want to kind of operate moving forward. And then four, it's about, you know, taking your stakeholders on that journey. So it's your employees, your customers, your from the sort of material considerations in your environment as well. Yeah.
Okay. So we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left, so I'll just ask 1 or 2 more questions. But I guess, Lili, where do you see ESG evolving sort of in the fintech sector over the next few years? So like we're just, you know, we've talked a little bit about disruptors pivoting. You know, it's a great opportunity for ESG to be embedded in products and services and get on the front foot, and it's going to lead to additional capital, et cetera.
Yeah.
But if you fast forward 5 years, what do you think the fintech sector is going to look like, particularly with an ESG lens on?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, even in big corporates, there, for a while, there's this trend of having a chief impact officer or chief ESG officer. And that's just, that's shifted away because we've all realized that it can't be one person doing this. Either the whole exec team is doing it or it's not being done, right? So that is the trend that we're going to see. It's going from a fringe, oh my God, it's an afterthought, I need to put this in my annual report, what do I need to tell the board, and how do I make it look good in front of employees and stakeholders, to a, oh yeah, I mean, we all understand the economy is transitioning to going, it is happening, right? And standards for S&G will continue to go up. They only have done so, and they will continue. And sometimes there's big jumps, like there has been in the last 2 years because of regulation. So it's an imperative. Everyone's gonna, it's the same way that I would say to every executive team leader, you need to become a market expert, right? You need to become an expert in ESG too. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean you need to go from 0 to 100, you know, but it's just like, just get on it, you know, be a little curious and think about it, put your thinking cap on. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's gonna happen in a big way. One of the things I talked about early, how important it is just to have a bias for action and do something rather than be perfect. Yeah. I think there's quite a bit of pressure because of this term greenwashing. Sometimes I feel the activist groups have accidentally created an environment that is not safe to experiment and learn. Mm. Because there's the feeling, okay, if I go and measure my carbon footprint but get it wrong, am I going to be dragged through the papers? Yeah. And is this going to be, you know, it's like, seems like a risky thing to do to even engage. Yeah. God forbid I open a conversation about, you know, gender equity in my conversation. Am I just going to get uproar and be shamed and blamed? Like, there's a lot of risk. And people don't move forward and change and experiment and innovate when there's risk. So I think I would like to take less. I'm not saying greenwashing isn't important to pay attention to, because you want to be authentic and you want to come at it authentically. and try, you're actually trying to experiment your way to something that's meaningful, but it is a journey, it is experimentation. It has to be okay to not get it right.
Well, I think you kind of mentioned you need to be able to ask questions and people be able to say things. I think that's got to be.
You got to really debate this, right? You can't be like, this is a sensitive topic, so we don't know how to talk about it. Like, for example, how many of you are maybe slightly uncomfortable that I just use the word patriarchy, right? Is that an uncomfortable term? So I think like just being able to talk about things and just being able to have that environment to talk about things, that's really the only real way you're gonna improve on ESG matters, especially on G, which is about good decision making, right?
Yeah.
Like what else is there other than kind of really improving the quality of the conflict and like having it more, and building our conflict skills. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I see it as a inevitable trend. Obviously, the numbers are out there around impact investing, right? There's a lot more impact investing dollars every single year. And the standards for attracting investment, investing in companies, it's just going up. It's just going up. So being on the front foot of all these trends means you're going to be smart about ESG. You're going to become a bit of a market expert on it. You're going to form your own point of view on it. And it's going to make you a better leader too, if you actually think hard about what are you going to do in your organization, irrespective of current products and services, and whether or not this is, a core part of your strategy or not. It still should be a core part of how you run your company.
Yeah, and I think the opportunity kind of building on that is responsiveness to changing environment. Who would have thought 4 years ago that we were going to go through a global pandemic, right? So how do you innovate and sort of stay close to some of those market changes before and as they're happening, and use that kind of innovation piece to problem solve, because the nature of the problems are changing over time. Some of them are there, continuously, and we're seeing that there's, the use of language as it's applied to different areas that you sort of spoke to, gives power and focus on different issues and problems and challenges to solve. And that, again, changes over time, but it's thinking also about then how do we look at some of those emerging challenges and opportunities and apply that innovation mindset to solve those. Yeah.
I think it's, great conversation. We'll conclude with one final question, 30 seconds each for the panelists. Maybe Viisti, I'll start with you. What does success look like for you in 2030 for the FinTech ecosystem?
Oh, that's a big question. I think I would love to see us hit our 43% target, net zero target, and the ability to contribute to that in some way, shape or form. So, thinking back to that first slide around where might you and how might we? And that's sort of the two challenge questions. Where might you focus in terms of your purpose, in terms of, changing your business to be integrating some of these ESG considerations, reducing your footprint, having more of that positive intent in terms of the social aspect, and how might we, from a sort of industry and overall value chain perspective, work together? There's this idea, the ecosystem, that was talked about, that kind of interoperability, that cross-pollination of ideas and innovation, but also moving things forward so that you're actually influencing up and downstream as well. Because as we start to get towards 2030, of course, we'll be looking at the scope 1, which is your impact, scope 2, energy use, and scope 3, which is all the supply chain stuff. So, that's the key, is the supply chain. Where do you fit? Who's in your supply chain? Whose supply chain are you in? And how do we kind of make a difference and really shift things positively from that perspective? Okay. Yeah.
And Lili, final question for you. I guess 6 years from now, you'll be a coaching guru known everywhere across Australia. What does the world look like in 2030 for you in terms of success for the FinTech sector?
I want to see FinTech actually just leading the creation of new kind of economic like chains of value, right? So as we transition to the green economy, Australia produces all these amazing critical minerals like lithium, right? We're not doing anything with them yet, but we will be and can be. And what's our role as financiers, as investors, as enablers, as data capturers, enablers of payments? Like, what's our role in building that, right? We should be leading that. And the same way that some of the big super funds, they have a lot of clout and they're long-term investors, and they are making decisions to say, I'm not going to invest in this and this unless you're really forward-thinking and you've got the vision that you can convince me of how you're building this new value chain that I want to see happen in the world, right? So fintechs can absolutely be doing that. And so we can do that on the E front and build the new value chains for the green economy. We can do that for S because we get the ability to build fresh new businesses with our own cultures, right? So that's a massive comparative advantage to be building the kind of social impact that we want and the kind of purpose-led companies that actually have positive social impact and great equity and great inclusion. That I fully expect, fintech should be leading there. And then G, good decision making. Fintechs attract really smart people. So really smart people know how to learn. So learning is really critical for good decision making, right? Because you're not going to have all the answers. You definitely don't know. And how are you going to learn to be the kind of leader that creates psychological safety and is able to create that underlying environment that makes constructive conflict possible and good decision making possible? So I want to see fintech excel at these and be, role models for the tech sector, role models, obviously, certainly for the financial services industry as a whole. But I think as a really integral part of the startup ecosystem, startup and scale up ecosystem, we should absolutely be leaders in all these respects in ESG. So in 2030, I would expect that if we think about who's leading in ESG, we'd be naming fintech.
Best in class. So hopefully that's where we're going to be. So that brings us to the end of the discussion. Thank you, Lili and Viisti, for your valued insights. I'm sure everyone online would agree this was a great session, great here in the room as well. Thank you to everyone in the audience for attending the FinTech Friday session, and we look forward to returning shortly with more FinTech content. The details of the webinar will be shared with you in the follow-up email from today's session. We also ask a few more questions in terms of where people are in terms of ESG. We'll also be sending out a short feedback survey, which we'll launch once we close the webinar. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. And we're going to be having a face-to-face FinTech Friday later this year as well. So hopefully we'll see everyone here at BDO. Have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.